So, women and minorities have more job opportunities available to them because of the war. So, let's talk about women first. So, during World War II, women make tremendous gains in industry. By the end of the war, women will make up nearly one third of the industrial workforce. And unlike previous trends where women who did work tended to be young and unmarried women, the number of married women actually took over the number of single women in the workforce during World War II, as many women were encouraged to go and take on war production jobs to be able to win the war faster and get their male loved ones home faster from war. A popular icon of women working during World War II is Rosie the Riveter. You've probably seen the very iconic poster with the yellow background of Rosie in her jean coveralls, flexing her biceps and saying in the bubble, "We can do it." This is actually the second version of Rosie the Riveter, created by the War Production Coordinating Committee. The first version of Rosie the Riveter is actually a painting by Norman Rockwell. In Norman Rockwell's picture, she's far less stylized, far more realistic depiction of a female riveter. This Rosie is very, very jacked. She doesn't have, makeup on, and her face impeccably made up, like the more idealized, popularized notion of Rosie. But they both have pretty good biceps, I must say. Okay. So Rosie becomes this icon, encouraging women to take on these difficult, oftentimes physically demanding jobs to make up for the labor shortage in the war. But women aren't just working at home on factories making war materials, they're also embarking on military service. About 350,000 women in the United States will enlist in female only auxiliary corps. So the names of these units depended upon which branch of service they were affiliated with. For example, the Waves were the women in the Navy, the WACs in the Army, the WASPs for the Army Air Corps, because the Air Force does not become a separate entity until after World War II. So these women are serving in women-only versions of the military branches, and most of them are not training for combat. In fact, none of them are training for combat. Instead, they're training for support roles. So the idea is that the women serving in these military branches would be trained for things like clerical service, as medics, and as trainers, particularly looking to the Air Force. The WASPs, or the female Air Force members, were actually oftentimes conscripted into doing test flights of new planes, into training male pilots on the basics of flight, and on flying these planes to more forward positions to put them into service after their manufacture. So most women are not seeing combat. The women who do see combat tend to be those who are unintentionally caught up in zones of war, particularly women serving as medics. Now, in the midst of all of this, women doing unprecedented jobs that they'd never done before, things like riveting and welding, joining the armed forces on a large scale, there's still this language in propaganda and promotional materials talking about the fact that what women were doing was a temporary sacrifice. So, in other words, we're not all of a sudden shifting to, you go girl style feminism, that women can do anything they want, right? But rather, they're talking about this as a sacrifice that women are making temporarily. So, gender roles are only being upended for the duration of the war so that we can help bring your husband, boyfriend, brother, son, etc., home from the war faster. Okay, so the idea is that when the war is over, these women are expected to voluntarily give up these wartime jobs and return to the domestic ideal of the woman as the stay-at-home wife and mother. Okay. So for many women, this is a liberating change, but only a temporary one during the war. So women occupy all kinds of positions during the war. There's a great picture that actually was recently used in a book called Nevertheless She Persisted of female firefighters at Pearl Harbor. This is a great example, this particular shot of women embarking on work that previously was dubbed really only appropriate or physically possible for a man. Now, minorities had previously only been allowed into very select positions within industry. Think the jobs that had the lowest pay and the dirtiest work, like custodians or foundry workers. Um, this is generally what they had been limited to because of de facto segregation in industries. This changes during World War II when the United States government establishes via executive order the Fair Employment Practices Commission. So think of the FEPC as the forerunner to today's Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or EEOC. This agency forbids discrimination in industries with government contracts. And during World War II, pretty much every industry had government contracts because of it being a total war. So all of these companies that were operating with government contracts were forbidden from discriminating based on race, sex, and religion in hiring and promoting their workers. During most of its existence, the Fair Employment Practices Commission was perpetually understaffed, underfunded, and in the not envious position of having to battle very entrenched racism, sexism, and anti Semitism. However, the FEPC did open the door for more opportunities for minority workers to be able to take these jobs. And many unions also took an active role in promoting minorities. Unions like the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, promoted the hiring and promotion of minority workers at the national level, seeing them as great prospective new union members. But at the local level, there was a lot more resistance to the presence of women and minorities in the workforce. In fact, despite the best efforts of government agencies to minimize strikes and job walk-offs, we do see a wave of strikes happen during 1943 and 1944 across the United States. Most of these strikes are what we call wildcat strikes. So in other words, these are not strikes that are authorized by the union. These are workers spontaneously, without the blessing of the union, walking off the job. And in fact, many of these strikes, particularly those in 1943, get the nickname hate strikes because these strikes were specifically about the hiring and promotion of minority workers. So in other words, these are white workers walking off the job because they don't want to work with minority workers. To give you an idea of just how economically damaging these strikes were, between March and June of 1943, only 5 of these strikes accounted for 2.5 million man-hours of labor lost, or the equivalent of over 100,000 days of labor. Okay. So this is a huge loss of productivity in a time where, again, during total war, we're trying to minimize any loss of production. So many of these strikes ended with initially businesses caving to workers and either firing or demoting minority workers who had whose presence had stirred these strikes. However, it's during 1943 that another executive order further expands and strengthens the Fair Employment Practices Commission. So after this second executive order, we start to see the government step in and say, no, you can't give in to these workers, these white workers who are throwing fits about having to work alongside somebody who's black or brown. You have to actually listen to these anti-discrimination guidelines. So we're going to start to see companies towing the line with the FEPC and pushing back against their white workers and saying, no, we can't demote or fire these minority workers. Government says we have to keep them. You're going to have to suck it up and deal. The relationship between business and labor remained tense. Many businesses only reluctantly recognized and dealt with unions, again because of government mandate. And many unions were very much reluctant to put aside all of their hopes, dreams, and demands for a better world post-war. And in fact, unions had reason to be optimistic. The rate of union membership skyrockets during World War II to about 15 million Americans, an all-time high at that point. And most unions wanted to maintain official government encouragement and recognition of union after World War II. In particular, they wanted to maintain this presence of unions so that workers can continue to enjoy safer working conditions, better hours, better pay, and more say in how the workplace was run, even once the war ended. This shift to war material production meant that the United States was now pumping out thousands of aircraft, 100,000 plus armored vehicles, 2.5 million trucks in factories located across the United States. This becomes the beginning of what we term the modern military-industrial complex. So in other words, this is where the military develops new technologies. Like, for example, during World War II, we have radar, sonar, jet engines, and computers introduced for the first time, used initially in military applications, and then military contracts with private companies to produce these on a massive scale, and then later after the war for domestic use as well. We have new centers of production that emerge out of World War II. If you looked at a map of the continental United States, urban areas in the South and the West Coast become centers of industrial production. Particularly cities like Los Angeles experience a huge spike in population growth due to the booming aircraft industry. In the South, we see Houston and coastal southern cities like Mobile and Beaumont become huge population centers due to the expansion of shipbuilding. California actually becomes the largest industrial state during World War II, a profound shift from what had been the Midwest, cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, as the center of industrial production. 2 million people moved to California during World War II, in part to take industrial jobs in places like Los Angeles. Overall, most Americans are on the move during World War II. Many people start to move away from rural or agricultural regions to go work in urban centers, especially in the West and the North. Many people leave the South, either moving to the coasts or again to urban centers in the North and West. And this move creates a lot of infrastructure problems for these cities. In some places, the population growth between 1940, which is a census year, in 1944, the year the United States government called a special census, in those 4 years, some of these cities, like Beaumont, experienced a 600% population increase. Okay, 600%. That's huge. And you can imagine when you have that many people coming in that short of a time, this is going to create all kinds of problems. This is going to create issues over housing. Okay, so it's going to be very expensive and very difficult to find places to buy or rent. It's going to create problems with recreational spaces, particularly when we look at the South, where we still have segregation in place, Jim Crow segregation, meaning that white people and non-white people are not allowed to physically occupy the same public spaces. It's going to create concerns for educational systems, for access to basic materials and food, again, which is complicated by rationing. So this is definitely something that all of this demand for production is drawing people to these areas because there are jobs to be had. But then when you get there to take your job, there's very little other resources for you, right? It's going to be very difficult for you to find a place to live, or food to eat, or a space on your downtime to enjoy.